In the summer of 1974, a young automotive engineer named Walter Hendricks witnessed something in the forests of Northern California that would change the course of American motorsports forever, though not a single soul would believe him for nearly 50 years. This is a story about two of America's most enduring obsessions. One lurks in the shadows of ancient forests, captured in grainy photographs and whispered about around campfires. The other roars through packed arenas, crushing cars beneath wheels taller than most people, sending crowds into absolute frenzy. On the surface, these obsessions seem to have nothing in common. Bigfoot, the legendary creature said to roam the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, and monster trucks, those magnificent mechanical beasts that have captivated audiences for decades. But what if I told you there was a direct line connecting them? What if the very existence of monster truck culture, every crushing impact, every impossible jump, every gravity-defying stunt, could be traced back to an encounter with something that shouldn't exist? This is the story no one wanted told. It's a journey through hidden history, suppressed patents, secret relationships, and a truth that will change how you see every monster truck event forever. And at the center of it all stands one man, now 78 years old, finally ready to share what he experienced in those California forests nearly half a century ago. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to a time when the very idea of a truck with wheels taller than a man seemed like pure fantasy. Picture America in the early 1970s. The muscle car era was dying a slow death, strangled by the oil crisis and increasingly strict emissions regulations. Those beautiful, powerful machines that had defined American automotive culture for a generation were fading into memory, replaced by smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles that prioritized practicality over power. The country was reeling from the fallout of Vietnam, disillusioned by Watergate, searching for something to believe in. Pickup trucks in those days were strictly utilitarian vehicles. They were work machines, designed to haul equipment and navigate farm roads. Nobody looked at a Ford F-100 and dreamed of glory. Nobody imagined these practical machines soaring through the air or crushing automobiles beneath enormous wheels. The technology for such things barely existed. More importantly, the demand wasn't there. Americans hadn't yet developed their appetite for automotive spectacle on that scale. Off-road culture did exist, but it was primitive compared to what would come. Enthusiasts modified Jeeps and trucks for mud runs and trail riding. They lifted suspensions a few inches, installed slightly larger tires, and called it extreme. The idea of a truck with 40-inch wheels, let alone the 66-inch tires that would eventually become standard on monster trucks, would have seemed absurd to anyone in the industry. The automotive landscape was focused on fuel economy, on meeting new federal standards, on surviving in a changing market. Innovation meant finding ways to squeeze more miles from a gallon of gasoline, not building vehicles of impossible size and power. Detroit's boardrooms were filled with conversations about downsizing, about efficiency, about adapting to a new reality where gas-guzzling excess was no longer acceptable. So what changed? How did we get from sensible sedans and practical pickups to 12,000-pound machines launching themselves 50 feet through the air? The answer to that question lies not in corporate decisions or market research. It doesn't come from focus groups or engineering committees. The answer lies in the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest, in an encounter between a skeptical engineer and something that defied everything he thought he knew about the world. Walter Hendricks never set out to change history. In the summer of 1974, he was simply a man doing his job, with no idea that his life was about to take an impossible turn. Walter was born in 1946 in rural Oregon, in a small town where logging trucks rumbled through at all hours, and the forest seemed to stretch forever in every direction. From his earliest memories, he was fascinated by machines. While other children played with toy soldiers or dreamed of becoming cowboys, young Walter spent his hours studying how things worked. He would take apart broken appliances, analyze the components, and put them back together better than before. His father, a mill worker, recognized the gift and encouraged it. By the time Walter graduated from high school, his path was clear. He enrolled at Oregon State University, pursuing a degree in mechanical engineering with a specialty in suspension systems. It was, he would later admit, not the most glamorous field, Suspension engineers didn't get the glory that engine designers received. They worked in the background solving problems that most people never thought about. But Walter understood something fundamental. The connection between a vehicle and the ground beneath it determined everything about how that vehicle performed. After graduation, Walter took a position with a small automotive research firm called Westbrook Technical Associates. The company had contracts with major automakers including Ford Motor Company, conducting field research that the big corporations didn't want to handle themselves. It was good work if unglamorous. Walter spent his days analyzing data, running simulations, and occasionally venturing into the field to study how vehicles performed in real-world conditions. In the summer of 1974, Walter received an assignment that seemed routine. The logging industry was experiencing an unusual number of vehicle failures in the forests of Northern California. Trucks were breaking down at an alarming rate, their suspension systems failing on grades that should have been manageable. Ford, which supplied many of these vehicles, wanted to understand why. Walter was sent to investigate. The assignment took him to the remote regions near Willow Creek, California, deep in the heart of Bigfoot country, though Walter paid no attention to such folklore. He was a man of science, of measurements and calculations. He trusted what he could quantify and dismissed what he couldn't. Stories of giant hairy creatures roaming the forest were entertainment for tourists, nothing more. His research station was a small cabin provided by one of the logging companies, situated at the end of a winding dirt road miles from the nearest town. The work itself was straightforward. Each day, Walter would follow the logging roads, examining points where vehicles had failed. He measured grades, tested soil composition, analyzed the stresses that these brutal roads placed on standard suspension systems. He documented everything meticulously, filling notebooks with observations and calculations. The first week passed without incident. The work was productive, even enjoyable. Walter found himself appreciating the majestic silence of the ancient forest, the way sunlight filtered through the towering redwoods, the clean smell of pine and earth. He was making progress on the suspension problem, identifying patterns in the failures that pointed toward specific design weaknesses. Then the second week began, and things started to feel wrong. It started with small things, easily dismissed. Equipment that Walter was certain he had left in one location would appear in another when he returned. Heavy equipment, components weighing 50 or 60 pounds, moved overnight when Walter was the only person for miles. He blamed his memory at first, then blamed wildlife, though he couldn't imagine what animal could move such weight. The logging crews he occasionally encountered began mentioning things, offhand comments delivered with nervous laughter. They spoke of feeling watched while working deep in the forest. They described an uneasiness that settled over certain areas, a sense of presence that made experienced woodsmen want to finish their work quickly and leave. Then there were the footprints. They appeared around Walter's cabin one morning, pressed deep into the soft earth after a light rain. Each print was enormous, easily 18 inches long and proportionally wide, showing 5 distinct toes. They circled the cabin, approached the window, then retreated back into the forest. Walter photographed them, measured them, told himself they were a hoax perpetrated by bored locals. But the depth of the impression suggested enormous weight, and the stride between prints indicated a creature far larger than any known animal in the region. Walter was a skeptical man, trained to believe only what he could measure. He measured everything those first 2 weeks. He trusted nothing he couldn't quantify. The footprints were an anomaly, certainly, but anomalies had explanations. Someone was playing tricks on the visiting engineer from the city. That was the obvious answer, and Walter accepted it because the alternative was unthinkable. He continued his research, pushing deeper into the forest each day, following logging roads that grew increasingly primitive the farther he traveled from civilization. The suspension failures he was investigating had occurred on some of the most remote routes, in areas where the forest canopy was so thick that little sunlight reached the ground even at midday. These were ancient places, unchanged for thousands of years except for the recent intrusion of human industry. On July 17, 1974, at approximately 3:40 in the afternoon, Walter Hendricks stopped being a skeptic. He had driven his research vehicle as far as the road would allow, then hiked another mile to examine the wreckage of a logging truck that had catastrophically failed 3 weeks earlier. The truck still lay where it had died, its chassis twisted, its suspension system utterly destroyed by forces that shouldn't have been present on that grade. Walter was examining a failed strut assembly, taking detailed notes on the metal fatigue patterns, when he noticed the silence. The forest had gone quiet. Not merely quiet, but absolutely silent. No birdsong, no insects, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. The kind of silence that pressed against the ears, that felt physical in its completeness. Walter had spent enough time in the woods to know this was wrong. Forests were never truly silent unless something had frightened everything into hiding. He straightened from his examination of the strut, scanning the trees around him, and then he caught the smell. It was unlike anything he had encountered before, a complex odor that combined notes of wet animal fur, decomposing vegetation, and something else entirely, something almost electrical, like ozone before a thunderstorm. Walter would later describe what happened next in clinical measured terms, the language of an engineer even when describing the impossible. The creature stepped out from behind a fallen redwood approximately 40 yards from his position. It moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large, rising to its full height as it emerged from concealment. It was over 8 feet tall, its body was covered in reddish-brown hair, matted in places but thick and seemingly healthy. It walked upright on 2 legs, its arms hanging past its knees, its shoulders impossibly broad, and it was looking directly at Walter with eyes that held unmistakable intelligence. Walter's body locked in place, every instinct told him to run, to flee, to put as much distance as possible between himself and this impossible creature. But his legs refused to obey. He stood frozen beside the wrecked logging truck, watching as the creature approached, watching as it did something that would change his understanding of the world forever. The creature walked to the mangled truck and examined it, not merely glanced at it, not simply passed by, but examined it with focused attention. It crouched beside the destroyed wheel assembly, reaching out with one enormous hand to touch the twisted metal. It picked up an axle component that Walter knew weighed over 100 pounds, lifting it effortlessly with a single hand, turning it to study it from different angles. Then it looked at Walter, and in that look Walter saw something that terrified him far more than any threat of violence. He saw curiosity, he saw understanding, he saw a mind at work behind those ancient eyes. The creature did not attack, it did not flee. Instead it walked to a nearby boulder and sat down, arranging itself in a posture that was almost contemplative, and it watched Walter. For nearly an hour, as the sun moved slowly across the narrow strip of sky visible through the forest canopy, man and creature regarded each other in silence. Walter's engineer mind, even in the grip of the impossible, could not stop working. He found himself studying the creature's anatomy, noting how its legs bent, how its weight distributed across its massive feet, how its body seemed perfectly adapted for moving through this difficult terrain. He observed the thick padding on its feet, the way its joints articulated, the obvious power coiled in its muscles, and somewhere in that endless hour, Walter's fear transformed into fascination. Here was a creature that shouldn't exist, examining human machinery with apparent understanding. Here was a mystery that defied everything science claimed to know about the world, and here was Walter Hendricks, witnessing it alone, with no one who would ever believe him. The creature eventually rose from its boulder, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something of its size. It cast one final look at Walter, a look that carried something he would spend years trying to describe, not hostility, not fear, something closer to acknowledgement. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing between the ancient redwoods as if it had never been there at all. Walter followed the tracks for nearly a mile before losing them on a rocky outcropping where the creature had apparently climbed straight up a cliff face. He stood there as the afternoon light faded, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. When darkness finally forced him back to camp, he didn't sleep. Instead, he filled 30 pages of his engineering notebook with observations, sketches, and questions. He wrote until his hand cramped, then wrote more. He documented everything he could remember about the creature's movement, its proportions, its apparent understanding of mechanical principles. He told no one. How could he? Walter Hendricks was a professional engineer with a reputation to protect. He had a career, a mortgage, responsibilities. The moment he mentioned what he had seen, all of that would evaporate. He would become a curiosity at best, a cautionary tale at worst, the man who lost his mind in the California forests, the engineer who started believing in monsters. So he kept silent, finished his official report on logging truck suspension failures, and tried to convince himself that the encounter had been some kind of hallucination. Heat exhaustion, perhaps. A waking dream brought on by isolation and stress. These explanations made sense. They fit the world as Walter understood it. But that first encounter should have been the end of the story. It should have remained a strange memory, filed away and eventually dismissed. But the creature came back. Again and again, it came back. Over the following 6 weeks, Walter documented 17 separate encounters. The creature, or one very much like it, seemed to be following his research. Every time Walter examined a failed vehicle component in the field, he would catch movement in his peripheral vision. Every time he settled in to document his findings, he would feel that familiar sense of being watched. And more often than not, when he looked up, the creature would be there. A pattern emerged that defied coincidence. Walter would arrive at a site, begin his work, and within hours the creature would appear. It kept its distance at first, watching from the tree line like a cautious student, observing a demonstration. But as the weeks passed, it grew bolder. It would approach the wrecked equipment after Walter stepped away, examining the components with those enormous, surprisingly dexterous hands. Walter began leaving equipment out deliberately. He would place failed suspension parts in clear areas, then retreat to a safe distance and wait. The creature always came. It would pick up each component, turn it over, test its weight and balance. Walter watched through binoculars, filling notebook after notebook with observations that no academic journal would ever publish. The creature's behavior was methodical, careful, and clearly intelligent. It didn't simply handle the parts, it studied them. Walter observed it comparing different leaf spring configurations, seemingly testing their flexibility. He watched it examine broken shock absorbers, pressing on the pistons as if trying to understand how they worked. Once, he saw it pick up 2 different axle housings and hold them side by side, as if evaluating their relative merits. Walter started making observations that challenged everything he thought he knew about intelligence and learning. The creature understood leverage. It understood mechanical principles. When it lifted heavy components, it didn't simply muscle them into the air, it found fulcrums, used natural features as lever points, distributed weight in ways that minimized effort. This wasn't instinct. This was engineering intuition, developed through observation and experimentation. One encounter changed everything. Walter was struggling to lift a heavy leaf spring assembly from a wrecked truck, trying to position it for examination. The assembly must have weighed over 200 pounds, and Walter's back was already aching from days of fieldwork. He was about to give up when he sensed that familiar presence behind him. The creature emerged from the trees, closer than it had ever approached before. Walter froze, his heart pounding, but the creature didn't advance threateningly. Instead, it watched him struggle for a long moment. Then it did something that rewrote Walter's understanding of what he was dealing with. It didn't take the spring assembly from him. It showed him a better way to lift it. The creature pointed with one massive finger toward a fallen log that Walter had dismissed as an obstacle. Then it gestured toward a flat rock nearby. The meaning was unmistakable. Use the log as a fulcrum, use the rock as a lever platform. Walter had been so focused on brute force that he had missed the elegant solution that the forest itself provided. He followed the creature's silent instructions, and the leaf spring lifted easily. When Walter looked up, the creature was watching him with an expression that might have been satisfaction. In that moment, Walter realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. This wasn't just an animal. This wasn't just a clever ape mimicking human behavior. This was a being with genuine engineering intuition, with the ability to solve problems and communicate solutions. From that day forward, Walter began communicating through gestures and demonstrations. He would show the creature how different components worked, and the creature would respond with its own observations. A strange partnership developed, one that existed entirely outside human language, but communicated profound truths about mechanics and movement. The creature showed him things that no engineering textbook had ever covered. It demonstrated how it moved through the forest with surprising quiet despite its enormous size. The key Walter realized was weight distribution. The creature never planted its full weight on a single point. Instead, it rolled through each step, spreading the impact across the entire foot surface, using the natural padding of its soles as a kind of organic shock absorber. It showed him how it climbed slopes that should have been impossible for a creature of its mass. The technique involved using multiple points of contact, keeping the center of gravity low, and making constant micro-adjustments based on terrain feedback. Walter watched and sketched and calculated, translating what he observed into engineering principles that could theoretically be applied to machines. The creature's ability to cross unstable ground fascinated Walter most of all. Where a human would sink into soft soil or stumble on loose rocks, the creature moved with confidence. It seemed to read the terrain instinctively, placing each foot precisely where it would find the most support. When the ground shifted beneath it, the creature's body responded automatically, adjusting balance and redistributing weight in fractions of a second. Walter was watching a creature that had solved every problem of moving a massive body through difficult terrain. It was, in essence, a living suspension system. Millions of years of evolution had refined its body into the perfect off-road machine, capable of navigating conditions that destroyed human vehicles, and it was showing him its secrets. Walter's engineering mind started making connections that seemed impossible but felt inevitable. What if vehicles could move the way this creature moved? What if instead of fighting terrain, machines could adapt to it the way this creature adapted? What if suspension systems could respond to ground conditions in real time, the way the creature's body responded? He began sketching ideas by firelight, filling page after page with concepts that had never existed before. Independent suspension systems that allowed each wheel to respond to terrain separately, inspired by watching how the creature's legs worked as independent units rather than coordinated pairs. Impact absorption systems that distributed force across multiple vectors, mimicking the way the creature's feet spread weight across their entire surface. Articulated chassis designs that could flex and adjust rather than fighting against uneven ground. The suspension concepts that would eventually revolutionize monster trucks were born in those sketches, in that impossible collaboration between a young engineer and a creature that science said couldn't exist. But there was more, so much more. The creature led Walter deeper into the forest one morning, moving slowly enough that he could follow on foot. They walked for hours, climbing ridges that tested Walter's endurance, descending into valleys he had never mapped. Just when Walter was about to collapse from exhaustion, they arrived at their destination, a canyon, hidden from any road or trail, sheltered by ancient trees that had never known a logger's saw. And in that canyon, Walter witnessed something that shattered his remaining assumptions about what he was dealing with. Others. There were others of its kind. Walter counted at least 12 individuals, ranging in size from creatures that dwarfed his guide to smaller ones that might have been juveniles. They moved through the canyon with purpose, engaging in activities that could only be described as social. He watched what appeared to be a family structure, with larger adults watching over younger ones. He observed what seemed like teaching, as older creatures demonstrated techniques to younger ones who attempted to mimic them. This was a community, a society, a people. Walter stayed hidden at the canyon's edge for 3 days, leaving only to find water and relieve himself. He watched the creatures interact, communicate through gestures and sounds he couldn't interpret, share food, and care for their young. He saw younger creatures learning to move, to climb, to handle their enormous bodies with grace rather than clumsiness. The adults were patient teachers, correcting mistakes gently, demonstrating proper technique repeatedly until the young ones mastered each skill. They weren't monsters, they were a hidden people who had survived by understanding the land better than humans ever could. They had developed a culture, a way of life perfectly adapted to their environment. They had knowledge that humans, with all their technology and ambition, had never acquired, and they had chosen, for reasons Walter would never fully understand, to share some of that knowledge with him. When Walter finally left the canyon, he carried more than sketches and observations. He carried a truth that would burden him for decades. These creatures existed. They were intelligent, social, and vulnerable. They had survived in the shadows of human civilization, and their survival depended on remaining hidden. Walter could expose them. His documentation, his sketches, his detailed observations could prove their existence to the world. He could become famous, vindicated, celebrated as the man who discovered a new species of intelligent life in the American wilderness. Or he could protect them. He could keep their secret, guard their sanctuary, and find another way to share what they had taught him. As Walter made his way back to civilization at the end of that summer, he had already made his decision. The creature's secret would remain their own, but the engineering insights they had shared would change the world, even if no one ever knew their true origin. When Walter Hendricks returned to civilization at the end of that summer, he carried with him 63 pages of engineering sketches, 200 photographs of footprints and disturbed vegetation, and a secret that would burn inside him for decades. The weight of what he knew pressed against his chest like a physical burden, one he would carry alone through the years that followed. His first weeks back were disorienting. The noise of traffic, the crush of people, the artificial rhythms of urban life felt alien after those weeks in the forest. He found himself listening for sounds that weren't there, scanning tree lines that didn't exist, searching for massive forms moving through landscapes of concrete and steel. The creatures had changed something fundamental in him, rewired his perception of what was possible, what was real. But Walter was also a pragmatist. He understood that his experience, however transformative, had to be translated into something tangible. The sketches he had made in those forest camps represented revolutionary concepts for absorbing impact, for distributing weight across challenging terrain. The key innovation was clear in his drawings: independent suspension systems that allowed each wheel to respond to terrain separately, to move with a fluid intelligence that no vehicle of that era possessed. This insight had come directly from watching how the creature's legs worked. Each massive limb operated independently, as the being navigated rough ground, adjusting constantly to maintain balance and forward momentum. The creature never fought the terrain. It adapted to it, worked with it, moved through it like water flowing around stones. Walter had watched this process for hours, sketching furiously, trying to capture the biomechanical principles at play. Another insight had emerged from studying the creature's foot structure. Those massive feet, which had first appeared simply as evidence of enormous size, revealed themselves as sophisticated engineering solutions. The way the creature spread its weight across a large surface area, the flexibility in the foot structure that allowed it to conform to uneven ground, the distribution of force across multiple points of contact. All of this became the conceptual basis for oversized tire designs that would revolutionize off-road capability. Walter returned to Ford with modified reports, claiming his insights came from observing wildlife and studying the natural terrain. It wasn't entirely a lie. He simply omitted which wildlife had provided the inspiration. His supervisor, a meticulous man named Douglas Chen, was immediately intrigued by the sketches. Douglas spread the papers across his desk, adjusting his glasses as he studied the detailed drawings. "These look like something for a military vehicle, not a logging truck," he observed, tracing the suspension geometry with his finger. "The articulation you're proposing here, the independent movement of each wheel assembly, this is years ahead of anything we're currently developing." Walter nodded, keeping his expression carefully neutral. The terrain up there demanded innovative thinking. "I saw opportunities that our current designs aren't exploiting." Douglas looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he picked up the phone and made a call that would redirect Walter's career entirely. By the following month, Walter had been transferred to an experimental division that few people in the company knew existed. The work that followed was exhilarating and frustrating in equal measure. By 1976, Walter had developed prototype suspension systems far ahead of their time. The test vehicles performed exactly as his calculations predicted, handling terrain that would have destroyed conventional trucks. The engineers around him were impressed, excited, eager to push the concepts further. But then Walter hit a wall that no amount of engineering brilliance could overcome. No one wanted to build the vehicles these systems were designed for. The market research was unanimous. Consumers wanted fuel efficiency, not off-road capability. The oil crisis had transformed American attitudes toward vehicles. Big was out, small was in, efficiency trumped everything. Walter found himself in countless meetings where his innovations were praised and then shelved. "The technology isn't the problem," executives would explain. "The timing is, maybe in a few years when the market shifts, I had invented a solution for a problem nobody thought they had." Walter would later reflect, It was the most frustrating period of my career, knowing what was possible and watching it gather dust in filing cabinets. Meanwhile, outside the corporate offices and engineering labs, something else was happening in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. News reports of Bigfoot sightings were increasing throughout the mid-70s. The Patterson-Gimlin film from 1967 was still being debated in newspapers and on television programs. Researchers and enthusiasts were mounting expeditions, setting up trail cameras, collecting plaster casts of footprints. Walter watched these debates with a secret smile and a heavy heart. He knew the truth, had experienced it firsthand, had seen things that would have settled every argument instantly. But he also knew something else, something that filled him with growing dread. The creatures were being seen more often because their habitat was shrinking. The logging industry he had been helping, the very work that had brought him to that forest in the first place, was destroying their home. Every board foot of timber that rolled down those mountain roads represented another acre of forest cleared, another refuge eliminated, another step toward extinction for a species that science didn't even acknowledge existed. This realization created a moral crisis that would shape everything Walter did for the rest of his life. He began secretly documenting logging operations, tracking the expansion of roads into previously untouched wilderness. He attended environmental meetings under assumed names, contributed anonymously to conservation organizations, used his engineering knowledge to identify critical habitat corridors. But he couldn't speak out directly. To explain why certain forests needed protection would require revealing what lived within them, and that revelation would bring exactly the kind of attention that would doom the creatures forever. Hunters, researchers, governments, corporations, all would descend on those forests with their own agendas, their own demands, their own ideas about what to do with an unknown species of intelligent life. So Walter remained silent, worked within systems he increasingly distrusted, and watched the forests shrink year by year. The official history of monster trucks begins in 1975, when a Missouri man named Bob Chandler bought a Ford F-250 and started modifying it. This is the story you'll find in every documentary, every article, every celebration of the sport. Bob Chandler was a construction worker who loved off-roading. He kept making his truck bigger, stronger, more capable. He added larger tires, then larger ones still. He upgraded the suspension, reinforced the frame, increased the engine power to handle the added weight. By 1979, he had created the first true monster truck, and he named it Bigfoot. The irony was not lost on me, Walter would later say, his voice carrying the weight of decades of hidden knowledge. Of all the names he could have chosen, he picked the one that connected his creation to mine, though he never knew why. But here's what official history forgot. What no documentary has ever revealed until now. Bob Chandler attended an automotive expo in St. Louis in 1977. It was a small event, mostly industry insiders and enthusiasts, featuring new products and experimental concepts that weren't ready for mainstream marketing. Walter Hendricks was there presenting suspension system concepts that his employer had no intention of actually producing. They met at Walter's booth, where diagrams and technical specifications covered every surface. Chandler was immediately captivated, asking questions that revealed a deep intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. He showed Walter photographs of his modified truck, explaining his vision for a vehicle that could go anywhere, handle anything, dominate any terrain. Walter saw in Bob Chandler something he recognized instantly, the same obsessive drive to push boundaries that had led Walter into those forests 3 years earlier. Here was a man who understood instinctively what Walter had learned from the creature. He wanted to build something massive that could go anywhere. The two men talked for hours, long after the expo had officially closed. Walter shared his sketches with Chandler, explaining the principles behind his suspension concepts, the importance of independent wheel movement, the physics of weight distribution across oversized contact surfaces. The suspension concepts Walter had developed, inspired by the creature, became foundational to Chandler's modifications. Chandler never knew where the ideas originally came from. Walter never told him about the forest, the creature, the summer that had changed everything. He simply presented the concepts as engineering innovations, solutions to problems that Chandler was actively trying to solve. Those ideas worked. They worked better than anything Chandler had tried before. Within 2 years, Bigfoot the truck was crushing cars at events across the Midwest, drawing crowds that no one had anticipated, creating a spectacle that seemed to tap into something primal in the American psyche. Every time I saw that truck I thought of the creature, Walter would recall. The name wasn't a coincidence to me. It was destiny, or something close to it. A connection that spanned from the ancient forests to the dirt arenas where engines roared and metal crumpled. Monster truck culture exploded in the 1980s. Other builders emerged, each pushing the concept further. Barefoot arrived in 1979, built by Fred Schaefer with modifications that reflected the same suspension principles. Gravedigger followed in 1982, Dennis Anderson's creation that would become perhaps the most famous monster truck of all time. Carolina Crusher, Taurus, King Crunch, the list grew year by year. All of them were using suspension and chassis concepts that traced back through various channels of influence to Walter's original sketches. The specific engineering solutions varied, but the underlying philosophy remained constant: create vehicles that could absorb punishment, adapt to terrain, move with a power and grace that seemed almost organic. I watched an entire industry grow from seeds I had planted. Walter would later reflect, his voice quiet with wonder, seeds that came from an impossible summer in the forest. Every truck that launched off a ramp, every vehicle that landed without destroying itself, carried within it the wisdom of a creature that the world refused to believe existed. But Walter's secret remained his own through all of this. He attended monster truck events occasionally, standing in the crowds, watching the machines he had helped create in his own indirect way. The roar of the engines, the crush of metal, the screams of the spectators, all of it felt both familiar and strange. This was his legacy, transformed beyond anything he could have imagined, yet rooted in those quiet moments in the forest when a creature had shown him a better way to move through the world. He retired from Ford in 1992, his contributions acknowledged with plaques and ceremonies that celebrated innovations whose true origin would never be known. He moved to a cabin in Oregon, not far from the forests where everything had begun. In the years that followed, Walter returned to Northern California multiple times. The forests had changed, roads pushing deeper, development fragmenting what had once been continuous wilderness. But he searched anyway, driven by hope and memory and something he could never quite name. The creatures were harder to find now. Their habitat had been reduced, their numbers presumably diminished. But occasionally on quiet mornings when the mist still clung to the trees and the forest held its breath, Walter would catch a glimpse, a massive form moving between the trunks, a face watching from the shadows, eyes that held intelligence and something that might have been recognition. They remembered me, Walter would say when recounting these moments, or at least I like to think they did. After all those years, after everything that had changed, they still knew the man who had kept their secret. In 2018, Walter Hendricks received a package that would shatter everything he thought he understood about that impossible summer 44 years earlier. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, unremarkable in its brown paper wrapping, postmarked from Washington, D.C. with no return address. Inside, Walter found a manila folder thick with documents, many of them bearing heavy black redaction marks that obscured entire paragraphs. But what remained visible was enough to make his hands tremble. The documents referenced a program called Timber Giant. The name alone sent a chill down Walter's spine. Page after page detailed federal monitoring of what the documents clinically referred to as unidentified bipedal entities in logging regions throughout the Pacific Northwest. Dates stretched back to the early 1960s, suggesting a systematic awareness that predated Walter's encounter by over a decade. But that wasn't what made him sit down heavily in his kitchen chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 72 years. His name appeared in several documents. Walter James Hendricks, Ford Motor Company contractor, field research assignment, Willow Creek region, June through August 1974. Someone had been watching him during that entire summer. Every encounter he thought was private, every moment of communion with the creature, had been observed and documented by eyes he never knew were there. The government knew about the creatures. They had known for decades. More than that, they had been actively managing information about them, suppressing sightings, discrediting witnesses, all while conducting their own clandestine research. Walter had spent his life guarding a secret that powerful people had possessed all along. But the revelations didn't stop there. Buried in the documents was evidence that a military contractor had quietly acquired copies of Walter's suspension concepts in 1978. The very sketches he had submitted to Ford, the designs inspired by watching the creature navigate impossible terrain, had found their way into classified military programs. Experimental vehicles with suspension systems directly derived from his work had been tested at facilities Walter had never heard of, for purposes that remained hidden behind walls of black ink. The creature's way of moving had inspired not just monster trucks, but classified military equipment. Walter's mind reeled at the implications. How many vehicles rolled across desert battlefields using technology born from his observations in that ancient forest? How many lives had been saved or taken by machines that owed their existence to an encounter between a young engineer and a being that officially did not exist? Walter's reaction was complex, a mixture of vindication and violation that he struggled to process. On one hand, someone had finally confirmed what he had always known. The creatures were real, his experience was real. He hadn't spent his life guarding a delusion. But on the other hand, the privacy of that summer, the sacred quality of those encounters had been an illusion. He had been watched, studied, used as an unwitting conduit for technology transfer. He began piecing together a larger picture from fragments scattered throughout the documents. The creatures had been discovered by the government as early as the 1950s, when logging operations in the Pacific Northwest first began reporting encounters that couldn't be explained away. Rather than acknowledge the existence of an unknown species, authorities chose concealment. The creatures became classified, their existence protected not out of compassion but out of strategic interest. Their habitat had been deliberately preserved in some areas, Walter realized with dawning horror, not for conservation, not for the creature's benefit, but to maintain access to research subjects. Logging restrictions that environmental groups celebrated as victories were actually about protecting government assets. Wilderness areas that hikers revered as untouched nature were managed zones designed to give the creatures space while keeping them accessible for study. They weren't protecting the forests, Walter understood. They were protecting their research subjects. The creatures were resources, nothing more, living laboratories of biological engineering that might yield insights worth billions. The documents suggested the creatures possessed knowledge that interested military researchers far beyond their physical capabilities. Their ability to move silently through any terrain, to survive in extreme conditions, to remain hidden for decades in regions that should have been thoroughly explored. These were skills that military planners desperately wanted to understand and replicate. How did a creature weighing several hundred pounds walk through dry leaves without making a sound? How did they regulate body temperature in freezing conditions without fire or shelter? How did they evade detection by satellites, aircraft, and ground teams? We had been learning from them for far longer than I realized, Walter concluded. I was just one small part of a much larger program, a program that viewed the creatures as assets to be exploited rather than beings to be respected. This revelation complicated Walter's feelings about his own work in ways he struggled to articulate. Had he been a tool all along? Had his encounter been manipulated, perhaps even engineered to position him as an unwitting technology transfer mechanism? The documents didn't say, leaving Walter to wonder whether the creature had chosen to reveal itself or had been somehow directed to do so, or had the creatures chosen to reveal themselves to him for their own reasons. This possibility haunted Walter most of all. If the creatures were as intelligent as he believed, as aware of their situation as his encounters suggested, perhaps they had made a calculated decision. Perhaps they recognized in Walter someone who would use what he learned to create rather than destroy. Perhaps they were playing a longer game than any government program could imagine. In the summer of 2021, at the age of 75, Walter Hendricks made one last journey to the forests of Northern California. His doctors had advised against it. His children had pleaded with him to stay home. His body was failing, weakened by years and a heart condition that made every exertion a gamble. But Walter knew his time was running short. He needed answers that no document could provide. He drove alone, his old truck climbing the familiar mountain roads that had grown rougher with each passing decade. The forest had changed since that first summer. More logging roads carved through what had once been unbroken wilderness. Cell towers rose from ridges that had never known human presence. The ancient trees that had stood like sentinels were fewer now, their ranks thinned by decades of harvest. But the forest still held its secrets. Walter could feel it as he pulled off the road at a spot he had visited dozens of times over the years. Something waited in those shadows, patient and enduring, as it had waited for centuries before humans arrived with their machines and their ambitions. He made camp in a clearing he had used before, setting up a small tent with hands that shook from more than cold. The nights were harder now, his bones protesting the uneven ground, his lungs struggling with the thin mountain air. But Walter persisted, sitting by a small fire as darkness gathered and the stars emerged in their ancient patterns. For 3 nights nothing came. Walter waited, listening to the forest's nocturnal symphony, wondering if his final journey would end in disappointment. Perhaps the creatures had finally retreated beyond human reach. Perhaps the encroachment of civilization had pushed them into deeper wilderness, where even a determined old man couldn't follow. Perhaps they simply no longer cared about one aging engineer who had kept their secret for half a century. On the 4th night it came. Walter felt its presence before he saw it, that familiar electricity in the air, that sense of being observed by something vast and patient. He didn't move, didn't reach for his flashlight or his camera. He simply sat by his dying fire and waited. The creature stepped into the circle of firelight with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. It wasn't the same creature, Walter knew immediately. Too much time had passed. The one he had known that first summer would be ancient now, perhaps no longer alive. But this one was unmistakably the same species, standing perhaps 7 feet tall, its body covered in dark reddish fur that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. They regarded each other across the decades, across the gulf that separated their species, across all the history that connected them in ways neither fully understood. I wanted to apologize, Walter would later recall of that moment, for the logging, for the development, for the roads and the cell towers and everything my species had done to theirs, for treating them as research subjects rather than neighbors. For all of it, the creature approached, closer than any had ever come before in all of Walter's encounters, close enough that he could see the intelligence in its eyes, the awareness that went far beyond animal instinct, close enough that he could smell that familiar scent, wet earth and forest, and something uniquely alive. Then it did something that made Walter's heart stop. It placed a hand, enormous and impossibly gentle, on Walter's shoulder. The weight of it was substantial but careful, controlled with a precision that spoke of awareness and intention. In that touch, Walter felt something he would struggle to explain for the rest of his days. I understood then that they didn't blame us, Walter said. They were sad for us. Sad for a species that had lost its connection to the land, to each other, to ourselves. They watched us build our machines and pave our roads and cut down our forests, and they felt something like pity. The creature withdrew its hand and turned, glancing back at Walter with an unmistakable invitation. Follow, against every sensible instinct, against the protests of his tired body, Walter rose and followed. The creature led him through the forest with patience, adjusting its pace to Walter's limitations, pausing when the old man needed to catch his breath. They walked for what might have been an hour, navigating terrain that should have been impossible in the darkness, but somehow wasn't. Walter felt guided, protected, as if the forest itself was opening a path. They emerged into a hidden valley Walter had never discovered in all his years of searching, and there, gathered in the moonlight filtering through ancient trees, was a community of the creatures, young and old, large and small, a family structure that mirrored human relationships in ways that struck Walter's heart with unexpected force. Here was proof of everything he had believed. Here was a people, hidden and enduring, surviving against all odds in a world that refused to acknowledge their existence. They showed him something that made him weep. In the center of their gathering space, incorporated into what might have been a shrine or meeting place, was the rusted hulk of a monster truck wheel. Enormous, battered, clearly discarded in the forest years ago by someone who didn't know or care where it landed. The creatures had found it, carried it here, and given it a place of apparent significance. They knew, Walter realized with certainty that transcended logic, somehow they knew the connection. They knew what we had built because of them. because of what they had shown one young engineer half a century ago. When morning came, the creatures were gone. The valley remained empty now, but still holding the evidence of their presence. Walter stood alone among the ancient trees, feeling more at peace than he had in years. Today, monster truck events draw millions of spectators worldwide. Bigfoot the truck has been replicated and rebuilt dozens of times. The sport has spawned international competitions, video games, movies, and merchandise worth billions. The trucks themselves have become technological marvels, running on 1,500 horsepower engines, riding on tires 12 feet tall, capable of leaps and landings that would destroy any conventional vehicle. When you watch a monster truck launch off a ramp and land without shattering, you're watching physics that a creature in the forest taught us. Every one of those trucks uses suspension technology that traces back to sketches made by Firelight in the summer of 1974. Every one of them bears the conceptual DNA of that impossible encounter, but the legacy goes deeper than engineering. The creatures showed Walter something about resilience, about adaptation, about survival against overwhelming odds. They had persisted through ice ages, geological upheaval, the arrival of humans with all our destruction. They survived by being flexible, by learning, by staying hidden when necessary, and revealing themselves when the time was right. Monster trucks embody those same principles. They are machines built to survive anything, to adapt to any terrain, to endure impacts that would destroy anything else. In their roaring engines and crushing wheels, something of the forest's ancient wisdom lives on. Walter Hendricks passed away in the spring of 2023, surrounded by family who finally heard his full story. He asked only one thing of them: share the truth. Let people know that our greatest creations often come from sources we never expect, that connection and inspiration can cross boundaries we think are absolute. The creatures remain in their forests, hidden but not forgotten. And every time a monster truck named Bigfoot launches into the air trailing smoke and thunder, something ancient watches from the shadows and remembers the man who kept their secret, who learned their lessons, and who changed the world because of what he witnessed in the trees.